Twilight became darkness, but Bjorn couldn't return home yet. He roamed the edge of the forest instead, listening closely between the hoots of an owl and the rustling leaves and bushes. Branches loomed over him, taking the shape of monstrous claws in the light of the full moon, and he craned his neck to catch the last bit of light in the distance. His heart was up in his throat at the thought of going even deeper into the forest, but his mother would surely have his head if he came back without Ignar. Just use your twin powers to find him, his friends would always say, but it didn't work that way. Bjorn and Ignar barely ever agreed on things, and if they had some sort of mythical connection to find each other, Bjorn wouldn't still be wandering around to find him. The stupidest thing was, he couldn't even remember what they had fought about. The wind grew strong, and shadows bounced up and down on his path, sometimes lighting up a shiny slug or beetle. A storm had raged the previous day, and the smell of rain and resin still remained. It stuck to Bjorn's fingers as he leaned against bark to step over a fallen tree, and his shoes were stuck into the mud. He groaned. It was his good pair, too. He would borrow Ignar's shiny black boots until he had time to clean them. He never wore them, so Bjorn doubted he'd miss them. He shivered from the strong wind, sweeping lingering raindrops from the foliage and on top of his head. If only he'd had Ignar's thick coat, too. He'd always seemed better prepared for everything, which left Bjorn to wonder if he was lost or just playing a trick on him. He would have called out for Ignar, but he was scared. The sound of the forest wrapped tightly around him, and who knew what kind of unwelcome attention his voice would attract. Their father always told them about stories about encounters with bears and wolves, and though their mother always smilingly emphasized that he liked to exaggerate, Bjorn and Ignar heeded his words. On top of that, their grandfather had a shed filled with the pelts of dozens of animals, of bears and wolves too. Bjorn was especially intrigued by the wolves. To have such predators displayed on the wall like that, there was something off about it, but he couldn't put his finger on it. His grandfather would stand next to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "If you ever find one, let me know," he would say. "They're my biggest trophies." But Bjorn never thought he would encounter one in a way like this. Dark clouds obscured the moon, and even though this path disappeared, he saw everything more clear. The terrain was no longer a mystery to him. He bowed close to the ground, and between the rain and the resin, he smelled things he'd never noticed before. The blood and pheromones of other animals and the scent of someone who was no longer in the area. He heard pounding steps that weren't there before and moved towards them with the effortless grace of a predator. He threw back his head when the footsteps ran and a howl echoed through the forest. But it wasn't his. The moon came back from behind the clouds, and Bjorn was pulled out of his trance. Confused, he stared up at the sky, his normal senses feeling suddenly dull and leaving him with a headache. His fingers tingled and his breathing was fast, a strange warm feeling running through his veins. Then he understood. He hadn't been looking through his own eyes. Another howl cut through the air and he fell forward, breaking into a sprint. Ignar was in danger. Whatever kind of connection they had, Bjorn could feel it now. He could feel the cold touch of Ignar's fear on his skin as he zigzagged around trees. He felt the warm breath of someone haunting him on his neck and a twisted despair on his tongue. Out of breath, and with his hands on his knees, Bjorn came to a stop. He wheezed out for air, but he didn't need enhanced senses to know he was too late. The iron odor pierced through his nose, and the grunts of a wild animal sounded dangerously close. His eyes watered, but the creature paid him no attention. It dug its fangs into his prey and blood spilled like black liquid over its lips, turning Bjorn's stomach upside down. A red glow came from his eyes, giving color to the gruesome monochrome picture, and Bjorn sagged into the mud, listening to the tearing and devouring of his human victim. When it was done, The creature turned its bloodied claws to Bjorn and growled. The guttural sound vibrated through him, but he couldn't move. His body trembled with apprehension, but he couldn't feel his legs. He stared wide-eyed as the creature inched closer and held his breath, his heart threatening to jump out of his chest. Then, it stopped. The creature inclined its head and whined like a pained animal, stepping slowly back. It shook its head and Bjorn released his breath in shock, whispering a single word. Ignar. Its eyes opened and locked onto him. The red glow faded and the trace of malice was lost. The creature stood at its full length and howled miserably at the moon before it showed Bjorn his fangs one last time and ran away. Bjorn screamed at him to wait, but he didn't listen. Tears rolled down his face, but his begs were left unanswered. He waited for seconds, minutes, but he didn't come back. And so, under the light of the full moon, Bjorn returned home without his brother.